Welcome to Bloodlore, where history whispers and silence remembers. Tonight, we uncover a tale sealed in ash and lullabies. But before we descend any further, subscribe to Bloodlore for more stories the world tried to bury. In the bleak winter of 1832, the countryside around Elmsbrook was still and gray. The trees stripped bare as though mourning something unnamed. It was on a cold January morning that Agnes Blackwell first arrived at Cradle House, a large stone building set on the edge of the woods, isolated from the town by nearly 2 miles of frost-bitten hills and winding paths. The house itself, though sturdy, bore the wear of time. Its windows were narrow and clouded with dust. The roof sagged at its center, and the walls bore cracks deep enough to hide secrets. It had once been a manor converted into an orphanage following a tragic fire in the East Wing 3 years prior. That wing, scorched and sealed, remained untouched, a silent reminder of what had been lost. Agnes stepped down from the cart that brought her with a grace that seemed unusual for an orphan. Barely 16, she was taller than most girls her age, with strikingly pale skin and dark, shoulder-length hair that framed her gaunt face. Her eyes, wide and soft, seemed always to be observing something others couldn't see. The matron, Mrs. Redley, was initially reluctant to accept another girl into the overcrowded home, but the letter from the church charity had been clear. Agnes Blackwell was to be placed at Cradle House, and she was to be given light duties immediately. There was no information about her family, no records of prior guardians, no mention of origin, only that she had been found wandering near the old station at Hollowmere with a note pinned to her coat. She belongs where the children sing. Agnes did not speak much at first. She did not cry, nor did she complain of the drafty halls or the tasteless porridge served each morning. Instead, she took to her tasks silently, sweeping, folding linens, helping the younger children with their meals. The other orphans warmed to her quickly, especially the little ones. They followed her like ducklings, clinging to her skirts and humming tunes she seemed to teach them in whispers. At night, from the top-floor dormitories, caretakers reported hearing soft lullabies floating through the halls. Oddly, they couldn't trace the source. The melodies were older than any the staff could recognize, sung in a language no one could quite identify. The children, when asked, simply said, "Agnes sings us the songs from under the floor." Within a week of her arrival, changes began to take root. The children, once rowdy and prone to fighting, became calm and unusually obedient. They played the same game over and over, drawing circles in the dirt and chanting short phrases before falling into silence. Their drawings became uniform, images of stairwells, doors with no handles, and a tall woman with no eyes. When questioned, they giggled or deflected, as if sharing a secret too big for adults to understand. Mrs. Redley, unnerved by the shifts, took notice of Agnes's habit of disappearing during certain hours. Though assigned to morning duties, she was often missing during twilight. More than once, she was found standing motionless in the hallway outside the sealed east wing, her hand resting gently on the doorknob as if listening. When asked what she was doing, she would simply smile and say, "They're sleeping." The sealed east wing had not been opened since the fire in 1829. A tragic incident that claimed the lives of 2 caretakers and 4 children. Since then, the door had remained locked, and the key kept in a box above the matron's desk. Yet one morning, Mrs. Redley found the box open, the key missing. She searched the halls frantically, suspecting one of the older boys, but all denied involvement. Later that evening, the key was found, sitting quietly on Agnes's pillow. Mrs. Redley accused her at once, her voice sharp with fear. Agnes did not deny it. She merely tilted her head and asked, "Wouldn't it be cruel to keep it locked forever?" That night, Mrs. Redley swore she heard footsteps from the east wing, even though the door remained closed and no one admitted to being near it. What unsettled her more was the sound that followed, a soft, distant lullaby, sung in harmony by several voices. The house seemed to change with Agnes's presence. The clocks began to slow, and the fire in the hearths refused to stay lit past midnight. The dogs from the nearby farms refused to go near the gates. Local children began waking with night terrors, whispering about a girl with no shadow who asked them to come walk the stairs. Rumors reached the town, but no one dared confront the orphanage directly. After all, Cradle House had always been a place for the forgotten, and those who lived there were already invisible to the world. And yet, in the hush of the evening, as snow fell silently over the roof, Agnes would sit with the children, brushing their hair or tying their boots, and whispering to them stories that no book had ever written. She promised them a place where the cold can't reach, and they believed her without question. The youngest children began calling her Sister Agnes, though no one had told them to. From the outside, everything seemed functional enough. The children were fed, bathed, and accounted for. But something beneath the surface, beneath the floorboards, beneath the walls, had begun to stir. Agnes Blackwell had arrived with nothing. And yet, she had brought something with her, something quiet, something patient, something waiting. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere inside Cradle House began to shift in ways that were difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the strange quiet that settled over the children. It was the sense that they were no longer entirely their own. Agnes Blackwell had integrated so seamlessly into their daily routines that it was hard to remember what life had been like before her arrival, yet something about the children's behavior was undeniably altered. They became synchronized. It started subtly. During meals, the younger children began humming the same tune in perfect unison, without prompting. The caretakers first dismissed it as mimicry. Children often copied each other, but the melodies they sang were oddly complex and haunting. They were lullabies, yes, but not in any recognizable language. Some of the older children claimed they couldn't even understand the words themselves. They just knew them, as if the songs had been embedded into their minds during sleep. They would wake up and hum without remembering why. More than the singing, though, was the drawing. All the children, especially those under 10, began to fill their sketchbooks, slates, and even the walls with the same images, always the same. A dark hallway, descending stairs, a door with no handle, and sometimes a tall woman with long hair and blank eyes, standing in the background with her arms open. The figure was often shown holding hands with children, all smiling. When Mrs. Redley demanded to know who had taught them to draw such things, the children would simply shrug or smile as if she were missing something obvious. "It's where we go when we dream," one girl whispered. "Agnes takes us there." Not all the children were so calm. A few older ones, those who had lived at Cradle House the longest, began to show signs of agitation and fear. 11-year-old Henry Mott started wetting the bed again and refused to sleep unless the lamp by his bed was left burning. 10-year-old Elsie Bragg, normally a lively and loud child, became withdrawn and skittish, staring at corners and muttering things like, "She's in the mirror again," and "Don't listen to the walls." One night Henry tried to run away. He was found hours later by a local shepherd, barefoot and shaking in the snow. When brought back to the orphanage, he refused to go inside, screaming that the house breathes when she walks. He never spoke another word, and within a week he was transferred to the city's infirmary for the nervously afflicted. No visitors were allowed to see him. Caretakers began reporting disturbances as well, unsettling sounds during the night. such as footsteps in the hall when everyone was asleep, doors creaking open without wind, toys rearranged while no one was in the room. Miss Farrow, a newly hired attendant, lasted only 4 days. She quit without warning, leaving behind a hastily scribbled note that simply read, "They're not playing. She's teaching them." Another staff member, Mr. Dent, found scratch marks beneath the beds of several children. Not ordinary scratches from wood decay or careless movement. These were deliberate carvings, names, dates, symbols that looked like mirrored letters or keys. When he brought the matter to Mrs. Redley, she dismissed it as childish nonsense. But when he returned to examine the markings again, they had been sanded away, not cleaned, removed, as if the wood itself had been smoothed over by invisible hands. Meanwhile, Agnes grew more reserved. She still did her chores, still soothed the little ones, still offered her silent, ghostly smile when addressed. But she stopped sleeping in the dormitories. No one could say exactly where she went at night. One of the girls claimed Agnes slept under the stairs, though no one ever found her there. Another child whispered that Agnes sleeps on the ceiling, which was quickly dismissed as fantasy until one night Elsie Bragg woke screaming, saying she saw Agnes above her bed upside down, watching with a face that wasn't hers anymore. No one believed her, at least not out loud. And the air inside the orphanage took on a strange stillness. Fires were harder to keep lit. Shadows lingered longer than they should have. Children stared too long at corners, at reflections, at cracks in the floor. There was a feeling, heavy and ever-present, that something beneath the house was stirring, and Agnes was the key to whatever it was. It was Miss Carroway, the cook, who first voiced what some had only dared to think. One afternoon, as she kneaded dough in the kitchen, she muttered to herself, "She's not teaching them. She's preparing them." The phrase caught in the wind and spread like a sickness. By now, the children were operating as a unit. They followed Agnes with unflinching loyalty, lining up behind her without being asked, watching her with wide, unblinking eyes. They began speaking in shared phrases, repeating lines that made no sense to the adults. "The stairs go down, not through," they'd say. Or, "We came from the cold, but she'll take us where it's warm again." They spoke as if rehearsed, as if remembering something that hadn't yet happened. Mrs. Redley, exhausted and fearful, started keeping a record of all these incidents in a small black ledger. She never let it out of her sight. But weeks later, when she opened it to read back her entries, every page was blank. The ink was gone, not smudged, erased, as though it had never been there at all. And in the silence that followed, the children hummed their lullabies once more, all at the same time, in perfect harmony. It was around the 3rd month of Agnes Blackwell's stay at Cradle House that the sealed East Wing became more than just a memory of tragedy. It became a magnet. There was no logical reason for the children to be drawn to it. Most of them hadn't even been born when the fire took place in 1829, and none of them had ever seen inside. Yet slowly, and with unnerving certainty, they began referring to it with strange familiarity. They called it the Quiet Wing, or the Sleeping Hall, or sometimes, in hushed tones when no adults were near, simply home. The East Wing had been boarded up after the fire that claimed 6 lives, 4 children, and 2 caretakers. The structural damage had never been fully repaired, walls blackened by smoke, floorboards weakened by water and rot. It was sealed, padlocked, and declared off-limits for good reason. But something about Agnes's presence made the wing feel less forgotten and more patient, as if it had been waiting for her. Caretakers began to notice that Agnes often wandered the hallway outside the East Wing, especially at dusk. She would pause at the door, place her palm against the wood, and stand silently, as though listening for something deep within. When questioned, she responded in her usual soft-spoken way. "They're not ready yet, but they're close." The first time she said it, it sounded harmless, but she said it again and again, and each time her voice sounded a little more certain, as though she were speaking not about a task, but a prophecy. That was when Mrs. Redley began locking the hallway door that led to the east side entirely. Only she held the key, or so she believed. On the morning of April 2nd, the key was gone. It hadn't been stolen. The lockbox on her desk was still latched and undisturbed, no signs of forced entry. But the key, specifically labeled E-Wing Access, was missing. That same night, 2 children were found sleepwalking, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the sealed wing's door. They had no memory of how they'd gotten there, only that they heard Agnes singing. The matron scolded them and dismissed it, but a chill had already begun to settle in the hearts of the staff. Soon after, strange sounds began coming from behind the sealed door. Not the creaks and groans of an old house settling, but soft things, rhythmic things. Knocking, whispers, humming, always around the same hour, just after nightfall. Staff tried to rationalize it, rats, pipes, echoes. But none of those things could explain the distinct sound of laughter, children's laughter, echoing from the charred wing of the house no one could enter. The children, for their part, began to act like they had already been inside. They spoke of rooms with no corners, mirrors that didn't reflect, and staircases that went down far longer than the house could possibly allow. One child claimed to have played a game under the nursery, though there was no such room beneath the nursery. Another swore she'd seen a bed made of wind and a rocking chair that kept rocking long after anyone had left it. When asked where they'd seen these things, they simply answered, "Behind the quiet door." It was Mrs. Redley who made the decision to check the wing herself. It wasn't courage that led her, it was desperation. Rumors had begun to spread beyond the house. A delivery man had seen the children standing in the windows late at night, all facing outward, unmoving. A neighbor swore he saw lights in the east wing, even though the wiring had long been removed. Something had to be done. When she approached the sealed door that night, she didn't find it locked. The padlock was still there, but unlatched, hanging loosely as if it had never been fastened. The door itself was slightly ajar. She hesitated, hand trembling, then slowly pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Something like old wood and burnt sugar. The hallway was just as she remembered. Walls scorched black. Wallpaper peeled like skin. Soot clinging to the ceiling beams. But it was colder than it should have been. Each breath steamed visibly in the air, even though it was spring. She took a step in. The candle in her hand flickered violently and went out. She turned back, intending to retreat, but the door behind her was already closed, and from deeper within the hall came a sound she had never hoped to hear again. A lullaby sung in that same unknowable language, joined by the soft pitter-patter of barefoot children dancing on wood. She was found in her bed the next morning, pale and shivering, her nightgown soaked through with sweat. When asked what she saw, she refused to speak. From that day on, she avoided the east hallway entirely, and she never asked about Agnes again. Afterward, Agnes began to spend more and more time alone. She no longer helped with breakfast or laundry. Instead, she sat on the staircase outside the east wing for hours, humming quietly, braiding bits of string into little talismans, which the younger children would wear around their necks like charms. She never asked them to. They simply took them with reverence, like they were gifts from a priestess or a shepherd. And the wing, once thought abandoned, no longer felt empty. It began to breathe again. The night it happened, the air was wrong, Not stormy exactly, not violent in the way one expects when disaster is coming. It was a stillness that settled over Cradle House like the hush before a funeral procession. No bird song, no rustling trees, just silence, heavy and stifling. The kind that makes children hide beneath their covers and caretakers lock their windows without knowing why. It was October 19th, a date no one in Elmsbrook would forget, though no one would speak it aloud. Inside the orphanage, the day had unfolded like any other. Agnes helped the children lace their boots for lessons. She swept the main corridor. She handed out the midday bread with quiet patience. But those who watched closely, what few caretakers remained, noticed something strange. The children who usually clung to Agnes had grown distant from everyone else, even from each other. They barely spoke unless prompted. They moved more slowly. They didn't laugh. Not even the youngest, who could normally be coaxed into a giggle with a tickle or treat. That evening, as dusk fell, the last caretaker on duty, Mr. Harrow, made his final round of the house. He noted in his journal, still found in the archives today, that everything was unnervingly calm. Agnes was sitting on the landing of the east staircase, not facing the door, but rather looking up toward the ceiling. The 12 children closest to her, ranging from 5 to 9 years old, were gathered nearby in a semicircle, all seated, all silent. Mr. Harrow attempted to engage them, asking what they were doing. Agnes responded without turning, waiting. He didn't push further. He was tired. The home was half-staffed by then, most having left due to the whispers, the drawings, the rumors no one dared speak plainly. The staff no longer asked questions unless they had to. He retired to the front parlor for the evening and would later swear he heard nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no slamming doors. Just quiet. Too much of it. By morning, Agnes and all 12 children were gone. No beds disturbed, no windows broken, no footsteps in the snow. The dormitories were perfectly tidy. Their shoes still lined up neatly beneath the bunks. Agnes's personal items, a brush, a folded shawl, a tin of buttons, remained in place undisturbed. Even the candles she used for nightly reading had not burned down past the wick. It was as if they had risen from their sleep and simply walked out of time. Panic spread swiftly through the remaining staff. Mr. Harrow collapsed in the entryway upon discovering the empty beds and had to be sedated. Miss Lennox, the only other adult left in the building, ran all the way to town barefoot, repeating the phrase, "She called them," over and over again. An official search was launched. The town constable, 3 field hands, and 2 men from the parish formed a search party and scoured the surrounding woods for 2 days. No footprints were found. The earth was soft from recent rains. Any steps would have left prints. But the ground around Cradle House was untouched. The east wing door, long sealed and locked, had somehow been opened. The lock remained in place, unbroken. Inside, nothing had changed. The fire damage still marked the walls, but there was no sign of anyone having entered recently. And yet, on the soot-covered floor just beyond the threshold, a drawing had been scratched with a piece of stone. 13 stick figures, 12 small, 1 tall, all holding hands in a perfect ring. No one claimed responsibility, no one even tried. The clergy was brought in. Father Whitaker of St. Matthias delivered a sermon of repentance for the unknown, though even he could not hide the trembling in his hands. Some locals began whispering that the land itself was cursed, or that Agnes had never been an orphan at all. But something older, something borrowed, sent to collect what was hers. The only other clue came days later when a stable boy from the western field found a scrap of paper wedged inside the hollow of a dead tree near the edge of the woods. It was a child's drawing, done in charcoal, showing a procession of figures descending a staircase that disappeared into the earth. At the front was a tall girl in a dark dress, her face blank. Behind her, 12 children followed, their eyes open but empty. Above the staircase, someone had scrawled in a looping, unfamiliar hand, "She brings them home, where the light forgets." No bodies were ever found, no signs of struggle. The children's names were read aloud in church, and Cradle House was closed indefinitely. Boards were nailed across every door. The east wing was sealed again, this time with iron. Those who spoke of the incident called it a tragic disappearance, an act of God, a shared delusion. But none of the explanations ever truly satisfied. Because in truth, everyone who had lived in Cradle House, whether for a year or a day, knew that something had been building. Agnes Blackwell had not simply vanished. She had taken them somewhere only she knew how to reach. The investigation that followed the vanishing of Agnes Blackwell and the 12 children was never meant to uncover truth. It was a gesture, a brittle performance to calm the townsfolk, appease the clergy, and fill the pages of the parish register with something other than silence. From the moment the inquiry was launched, it was already collapsing in on itself. At first there was urgency. Elmsbrook's town council, a stiff collection of aging men who had long dismissed Cradle House as someone else's responsibility, suddenly found themselves under pressure from neighboring districts. Children had gone missing. A girl placed in their care, by the church no less, had vanished, and a growing number of whispers hinted at unnatural happenings. The kind of whispers that linger too long, that don't fade with sunlight. Something had to be done. 2 investigators were appointed by the diocesan committee, both from outside Elmsbrook. One, Jonathan Keene, was a young clerk from Holshire with sharp handwriting and a taste for the procedural. The other, Lionel Pratt, was older, a retired constable pulled from the edge of obscurity for his familiarity with strange cases. They arrived on a gray morning, carrying ledgers and lanterns, stepping over the threshold of Cradle House with little more than skepticism and damp wool coats. They didn't stay long. Their initial reports, now archived in brittle, water-stained parchment, began like any other. Timelines, witness statements, floor plans, the usual tools for making sense of loss. But even their earliest notes betray something else, an unease they never dared name outright. Mr. Keene's journal includes odd little comments in the margins. Why no dust in the east wing? Or children's shoes in perfect line? Intentional? Meanwhile, Pratt made less frequent notes, but seemed increasingly disturbed by the house itself. One line from his private notebook stands out among the rest. "We are not alone in this place. It listens." By the 3rd day of their inquiry, the 2 men had decided to interview the remaining staff individually. But something went wrong. Miss Lennox, still rattled from the night of the vanishing, attempted to run when questioned, screaming that the stairs are mouths and the house is hungry. She was restrained and later removed to an asylum outside Chesterbrook, where she lived in near Catatonia until her death years later. More troubling, however, was the disappearance of Pratt and Keene themselves. They were last seen entering the East Wing late in the evening on October 24th, just 5 days after the event. A local carpenter, hired to assess the structure's stability, saw them both pass into the wing with candles and satchels. He left shortly after and expected to return the next morning. But by dawn, they were gone. Their rooms undisturbed, coats and boots left behind, candles still lit on their desks, and again, no signs of exit. No tracks, no sound. That was the end of the official investigation. The church declared the case spiritually unresolved and quietly reclassified Agnes Blackwell's file as not to be pursued without authorization. The remaining children at Cradle House, those who had not vanished, were relocated to other institutions, often under assumed names. No formal ceremony was held for those who had disappeared. Their names were etched into a single wooden plaque, placed not in the chapel, but buried beneath the floorboards in the west corridor, as if remembering them aloud might stir something back into motion. And perhaps it might have. Because not long after the case was shut, odd things began happening to those connected with it. Mr. Harrow, who had discovered the empty dormitory that morning, was found drowned in his own well the following spring. No signs of struggle, just his slippers lying neatly at the edge and muddy footprints that led nowhere. One of the town council members, who had pushed hardest to close Cradle House, died in a fire a year later. The cause? A lamp that lit itself. The fire started in his study, and among the few items pulled from the ashes was a charcoal drawing. 12 children and a tall girl, all holding hands, descending a staircase made of stone. Quietly, the town decided to forget. Cradle House was sealed again, this time under watch. Iron bars were placed over the east wing's windows. The property was declared structurally unsound. A sign was nailed to the main gate. No entry, grounds cursed by church decree. It should have ended there. But it didn't. In 1911, nearly 80 years after the disappearances, a demolition crew was hired to tear the structure down. By then, no one truly remembered what had happened. Only that Cradle House was a place no one lived and no one spoke of. The crew arrived with axes, hammers, and a team of 6. They made it to noon before the work halted. One of the workers, a man named Elias Ward, struck the floor in what had once been the nursery. The boards split, revealing an old hand-carved trapdoor. Beneath it, a narrow spiral staircase descended into darkness. What they found at the bottom was not on any map or blueprint. A small room. 13 child-sized rocking chairs, all arranged in a ring. Each one cradled a porcelain doll, clothed in aged, rotting fabric. The clothes matched descriptions of what the children had been wearing the night they vanished. And in the center of the ring, wrapped in oilskin, lay a journal. Agnes's name was written in ornate lettering across the front. Its final entry, written in delicate script, said only this: "They remember the cold, but down here they never have to feel it again." The weeks that followed the disappearance of Agnes Blackwell and the 12 children were marked not by discovery but by a deepening quiet, one that settled over Cradle House like dust on forgotten books. The panic that had gripped the orphanage in the immediate aftermath soon gave way to a slower, heavier dread, as if the building itself was absorbing the loss. Outside, villagers waited for answers. Inside, nothing made sense. The official inquiry came swiftly. Not out of urgency to find the missing, but out of obligation. The church needed records. The parish council needed closure. Elmsbrook couldn't bear the weight of silence indefinitely, not when it concerned children. The bishop's office dispatched 2 investigators from the regional diocese, chosen for their perceived reliability and discretion. They were instructed not just to uncover what had happened, but to explain it in language that could be digested by the public, something neat, something survivable. They arrived at Cradle House on November 2nd. Mr. Alton, a mild-mannered academic with little field experience, and Inspector Rhodes, an older man whose years with the constabulary had worn the patience from his eyes. Their presence gave brief hope to the townsfolk who lined the iron gate on the first morning, watching the 2 men step inside with lanterns, maps, and a guarded sense of purpose. But Cradle House had never been a place that opened itself to visitors. Alton and Rhodes began with interviews. what few staff remain, and two of the older orphans who had been transferred back temporarily to assist. The testimonies were disjointed. One child insisted the missing 12 had gone down the red stairs, though no such stairs existed on the property. Another described Agnes leading the children into the east wing, but not the real one, the one that hums. Staff reports were no more helpful. Miss Carraway, the cook, said only that the children had changed after Agnes arrived, that they listened more to the walls than to people. None of these accounts fit comfortably into a report. Still, the investigators pressed on. They examined dormitories, found the beds still made, shoes neatly arranged. No signs of struggle, no sign of forced entry or exit. It looked, as one note in Rhodes's journal would later read, less like they left and more like they were unmade. The East Wing, of course, drew the most attention. It had already been unsealed by that point, though no one could say how or when. Alton insisted they explore it fully. The door was stiff, but not locked. Inside, the damage from the 1829 fire remained. Soot-scoured walls, warped floors, beams darkened with age and ash. But something else lingered in the air, a scent that didn't belong to the building. Not rot, not mold. Something faintly sweet, like lavender mixed with old milk. They found strange things there. Chalk marks along the walls, circles within circles, always 13. Bits of twine tied into knots and tucked into corners. A child's toy left in a line of dust, unmoving, yet clearly not untouched. Beneath the charred floorboards, Alton discovered what appeared to be a hollow. He reached into the gap and retrieved a ribbon, still pink, still soft, still tied in the shape of a bow. It hadn't rotted. It hadn't aged. By the third day, Alton stopped writing his daily summaries. Rhodes, in his stead, wrote a single line. "The house won't let us speak it plainly." That night, the two men retired to the study room, one of the few places left in the house that still felt somewhat intact. They lit a fire. They didn't speak. Around midnight, Miss Carraway claimed to hear footsteps upstairs, followed by the distinct sound of a lullaby. Soft, melodic, sung not by one voice, but many, children in perfect harmony. She went to wake them, forgetting that those children were no longer there. When she checked the study the next morning, both men were gone. Their belongings remained. Coats still on the hooks, a kettle still warm, not a single mark of departure, just like the others. The inquiry, such as it was, ended that day. There was no ceremony, no statement from the church, only silence. The town of Elmsbrook responded the way many small, frightened communities do, with retreat. Cradle House was condemned officially this time. Iron bars placed over the windows, the grounds left to grow wild. No children were placed there again. The property was never sold, never repurposed. It sat quiet and aging, like a wound the town refused to look at. Unofficially, people spoke of other things. Of a boy seen in the woods, barefoot in winter, singing to no one. Of a young woman, tall, pale, with dark hair, standing at the upstairs window of the orphanage long after the place was shuttered. Hunters avoided the grounds. Local children dared each other to touch the gate but never crossed it. And in the years that followed, those connected to the incident began to vanish. A clerk who handled the case records disappeared en route to the diocesan archive. A priest who once cared for Agnes was found in his rectory, clutching a page torn from a hymnal. On it, 13 names had been written in charcoal and crossed out in blood. The records of the case were quietly sealed. Agnes Blackwell's file was never completed. Her age, origins, and placement history remained blank. Her photograph, the only known image of her, faded so completely that by the end of the decade, it was nothing but shadow and a white paper. People tried to forget, but not all stories fade. Some stay beneath the surface, buried like roots in old soil, waiting for the right season to bloom again.